Welcome, and we're so glad that you're here for another mental health and wellness chat. I'm Brittany, and I'm here with
Madison,
and we're two of your VC Counseling Center counselors,
an associate.
here to have real conversations about the emotional challenges that students face and explore navigating them. So, have you ever said yes to something that just didn't feel quite right, just to avoid disappointing someone else? Or have you found yourself constantly putting others' needs ahead of your own, even when you're overwhelmed and burned out? Many of us grew up believing that being nice means being available, agreeable, and accommodating. But sometimes over time, this can come at a cost to our energy, well being, and even our sense of self. So, in today's episode, we're going to explore setting boundaries and people pleasing habits. We're going to talk about why boundaries aren't about shutting people out, they're more about protecting what matters most. So, we're going to offer some practical ways to start honoring your own limits, even if it might feel uncomfortable sometimes. So, this isn't about being selfish, it's about being honest, grounded, and whole. And I'm excited about this today. We are early in the semester, right? Everyone's kind of panicking. Everyone's exhausted already, tired, hitting a burnout limit. So I feel like this is very well timed, I guess is what I'm trying to say. That, let's jump into a definition first. I'll let Madison take it away.
For sure. So boundaries are limits that we set to protect our emotional, physical, and mental well-being. I think that's a very important thing to understand because there's so often where, we are trying to connect with others, we have relationships with others, and, we end up putting ourselves, our own needs kind of on the back burner. And boundaries are a way to kind of shift that, make it to where we are being fulfilled from the relationships that we have with others. Both parties are being, satisfied and fulfilled in a meaningful way. So I think that's a really big part of boundaries and what they are and the goal of boundaries.
Yeah. And that we're not just draining our own battery 24/7 for other people.
Exactly.
And there's nothing wrong with being there for others and, holding space for others. I mean, we both do that every single day as counselors, right? Like, I feel like boundaries are the only way that you can do that in a healthy way where you're not just giving yourself all the time.
Yeah. And, just the biggest point is that, having good relationships, good connections shouldn't have to come at the expense of abandoning yourself on a constant basis. So yeah. So there's a lot of different types of boundaries. I'm going to briefly just talk about those kinds. One being physical. So that can look like, our personal space, physical contact with others. It's like kind of stay in your bubble, I'll stay in mine. That's
How
kind
close?
of what I think about.
That's a good one too, is like, how close do you stand to someone when they're talking to you? Like, are you that person that's like inches from their face? Or are you that person that kind of like gives a foot or two of distance between you and them? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Additionally, there's emotional boundaries. So that can look like, how we maybe express our emotions, share with others. Sometimes we can be, it can be easy to overshare whenever we're meeting new people right away. And, it's based off of just wanting to connect with others. But sometimes we can maybe adjust that. Sometimes we can go into a relationship and just share little by little and just see how others respond to that. And then that's how we can go about continuing that relationship. Additionally, with emotional boundaries, it's really about not letting the emotions of others rub off onto us. I hear that a lot. Like, they're really stressed, so now I'm feeling really stressed, or they're feeling really, frustrated and upset, so that kind of rubbed off on me. And that can be really difficult in relationships and can create a lot of distress that isn't even our own. So I think that's a really important type of boundary to consider, for sure.
And I think it's important too, as we're considering these categories of boundaries, to consider the fact that they exist on a spectrum too, right? So it's not necessarily about being one way or the other. It's just kind of identifying where you fall on this spectrum. So like you were saying, are you that type of person that, when you meet someone, you connect by oversharing about, every aspect of your life? Or are you that type of person that you meet someone new and it takes you a while to warm up because you have a boundary of, I'm not going to share vulnerable pieces of me with a complete stranger in some way.
Right.
So everything's kind of on a spectrum here. If we want to get clinical, it goes from porous to rigid. So porous is like having very little boundaries, and rigid is having very strict boundaries of, I am going to do this and I expect other people to do that, basically.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Another type of boundary is a time boundary. So maybe that looks like giving yourself enough time to take care of all of your responsibilities, whether that's, at work, at school, in your personal life, rather than kind of being told what to do by others and feeling like we have to accommodate others so frequently to where we're stretched thin. So that's a big one that I hear people struggle with, understandably. Additionally, another type of boundary is relational boundaries. So that's kind of the limits and expectations that we have for our relationship as well. Digital boundaries, this can be a big one. The way that we kind of engage social media, the way we use our technology, it can be very draining to always be exposed to news or, highlight reels of people's lives. It can get easy to become consumed by that, to start getting into self-comparison, to start just being really stressed on a constant basis. So setting those limits with yourself and your technology use can be very helpful for sure. And then lastly, academic boundaries. So maybe that's just finding ways to succeed both academically while maybe also maintaining kind of a personal life and academic life balance. The purpose of all these boundaries is to help us maintain self-respect, reduce resentment, and foster healthy relationships. Because at the end of the day, you deserve to put your needs first and to feel like you are getting something out of the relationships just as much as the other person is. So, yeah.
And going back to the note about boundaries existing on a spectrum, right? So sometimes, due to our life circumstances, our upbringing, the relationships that we've had in our life, there's a very common pop cultural term called people pleasing, where it's this idea that, once again, if we go back to the spectrum, right, this is on the poorest end of the spectrum of things, where when we experience people pleasing types of behaviors, typically we end up kind of prioritizing other people's needs, comfort, approval, demands at the expense of my own. And I really want to emphasize the end of that statement because, caring about other people isn't people pleasing. It's whenever I care so much about everyone else that I put them before myself. So this, for example, could look like, maybe I, have kids, a partner, I have friends that I care about, I have family that I care about a lot, and I have the best intention of taking care of and being of service to all of these different people in my life. But sometimes we do that in such an excess that we don't take time for ourselves. Or a great example is like, you have your whole day planned, it's super busy, it's really rigid and structured. And then someone comes in and says, hey, can you pick me up at this time? And can you do this for me at this time? And I need you to drop everything to do this for me right this very second. A pattern of people pleasing would be to, yes, drop your schedule, maybe miss class, maybe, miss the things that are important to you for that other person's benefit. I mean, when this becomes a pattern where we're constantly kind of abandoning ourselves in order to keep other people in our life happy, that's where it kind of tends to border on people pleasing. Usually when we people please, it's often rooted in just like a fear of conflict, sometimes a fear of rejection, or even just learned behavior that this is what I was taught that I'm supposed to do and how I'm supposed to interact with other people. It's a learned behavior from childhood of like, this is what I was taught of how I'm supposed to sacrifice myself for everyone else in my life. Where it's like, there's no black and white test or question that we can ask you. And it's like, yes, you absolutely struggle with people pleasing. This is a pattern over a very long period of time that takes a lot of self-reflection to step back and look at and say, okay, do I always abandon myself for other people 9 times out of 10?
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest thing from that is just learning that this is something that is learned and it ultimately had a protective function or otherwise we wouldn't be doing it. I don't think anyone who's a people pleaser would be doing this by choice. This is something that at one point in time, it felt like the safest and most adaptive way to be and to kind of get through difficult
And
experiences.
It helps us connect with other people, which is all that we want.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. I mean, the idea of being, rejected or not liked or not accepted is extremely difficult for so many people. And that's what keeps these, people pleasing behaviors going. So yeah, absolutely. It's difficult to think of being rejected for sure.
So some general signs that might point to people pleasing. Now, once again, not therapy, not counseling, none of these podcasts ever are, but these are some general examples that might indicate people pleasing. But once again, they could mean something else entirely. So for example, having a habit of saying yes and agreeing to things when you actually really don't want to do that thing. So saying yes when you mean no, over apologizing or avoiding conflict. General burnout is a really good indicator, right? So just feeling exhausted at the end of your rope all the time because you have so many things that you're juggling, so many people that you're juggling, and generally just feeling like you're not a priority in your life. A question I like to ask people that I suspect people pleasing with is to ask them, what do you do for yourself though? What is the selfish thing that you do in your life that you do for your own benefit and your benefit only? What is that thing? And a lot of times when someone can't answer that for me, or they say, there isn't a thing that I do for me, everything I do is for everyone else, then that for me can be a good indicator of, okay, maybe we're struggling with some people pleasing or difficulty with boundaries in this situation.
Yeah, for sure. People don't know what caring for themselves looks like. They don't even really know who they are sometimes because they're so used to just doing what's expected of them to avoid that rejection, to be accepted by others. So absolutely. Yeah.
And finding meaning in being in service to others is absolutely amazing and gives us so much purpose and meaning to our life until it gets overwhelming and then it doesn't anymore.
Right.
It's one of those things where there's like a fine line of how much is too much.
For sure. So now we're going to discuss the difference between boundaries and demands because sometimes these two can get confused. So we're going to kind of help hopefully clarify those things now. So like I said earlier, boundaries are personal limits that you are setting for yourself. So whenever we're working on setting boundaries, we really want to focus on what you are going to do or allow, not on controlling others, because at the end of the day, we can only control ourselves and not other people. So that's a really big component of boundaries. It's you taking action, not waiting for others or hoping for others to change, because like I said, that's not something that we can always count on. So ultimately, boundaries come from a place of self-respect, not control. So a good example of this could be, if you continue yelling, I'm going to step away from this conversation. So you're not telling the other person what to do. Instead, you're stating what you will do.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a huge
And I
part.
think that's a really good point of the difference, because it's not, a lot of times people get confused and say, well, I told him that my boundary is that if he keeps yelling, I'm going to leave, or if he better stop yelling.
Yeah.
But once again, this is a statement that reflects me trying to control their behavior. I'm telling them what they're going to do, which is not what a boundary is. A boundary is me saying what I am going to do, and it is not about controlling other people. So I liked your example about yelling. Like, if you continue yelling, I will leave this conversation. That's 100% in my control.
Oh yeah, for sure. And like we said, it's just, we don't want to be in a relationship where there's always, high conflict and yelling. Of course, conflict is a part of relationships, but, sometimes we do have to set those limits and really take the control, put it back in our hands and say, okay, if I'm not satisfied completely with how this relationship, how this connection is going, I have, more power than I think to do something about it, to have a more fulfilling and respectful relationship.
And we've already kind of touched on, but the difference, so demands in contrast to boundaries, demands are attempts to control or change someone else's behavior. They're often ultimatums, and sometimes they end up accidentally escalating conflicts a lot of the time. And usually demands come from a place of frustration or fear. They're not grounded in clarity. They're not grounded in, self-reflection. So for example, you need to stop yelling right now or else. This tries to force the other person to choose a behavior or do something. And ultimately, like Madison said, we can't force other people to do anything. So sometimes this might not be effective or respectful in a situation, just depending on the situation, right? So a demand is me really trying to change someone else's behavior. Whereas, like Madison said, a boundary is me setting an expectation or a rule about my own behavior and how I'm going to handle the situation. Even if I can't control that, you're going to start yelling about this topic. I can set a boundary of, I am not going to remain here if that behavior happens.
Yep.
So hopefully we've kind of reinforced the difference between these things, because I do see that a lot. People will say, I set boundaries this week. I really told them what they were going to do with me. And it's like, close, but we need to do a little bit more digging internally to see how you can take control back for yourself in these situations, while still also be respectful of other people, give them their choice, give them their space. But also not abandon yourself, and also be there for yourself and live up to your own values and expectations. So, and boundaries are about self-regulation. It's not about controlling other people. I'm just trying to figure out what is healthiest for me and then act based upon that. So yeah, when we make demands, really we just set ourselves up for power struggles. Healthy boundaries say, I care about you, but I also care about myself too. So I'm going to do what's best for me, and maybe for both of us in this situation too.
Yeah, absolutely. So boundaries are ultimately something that can be really difficult to set. Sometimes we don't even know what that looks like. And there's a lot of reasons why it can be difficult to set boundaries. One is being, just this fear of being seen as rude or selfish. Like we, of course, like we were saying earlier, we want to be liked by others. People's approval of us is so important to us. So if we are, setting this boundary, we're sticking up for ourselves like we never have before, of course there's going to be that worry that, oh my gosh, what are they going to think about what I just did or said? Like, that's extremely scary to think that they're going to see me in this negative light. Like, that's our biggest fear at the end of the day. So of course that makes it hard to set boundaries. Additionally, we have this desire to be liked or needed. Connection is something that's been important to human nature. It's like since the beginning of time. So like, of course, kind of learning to say no, stick up for yourself. It's almost like a threat to the relationship in a way. And that's, once again, extremely scary.
Well, and I hear that, and I like that frame that you give it, though, because I mean, it's a threat to the way the relationship has gone so far. Because if I set a boundary here and I say, hey, I don't really have the space for this right now, I'm going to not do that right now, but we can talk about it tomorrow. That's going to change the way that we interact. They're going to have a new reaction that I've never seen before. And it's scary.
Right. Another big thing that I've heard this, in the therapy space for sure myself is the guilt for saying no. That's a huge one, because whenever we are people pleasers, we are so used to just living based off of what we think others want from us, living for others ultimately. So the idea of putting myself first and saying no, sticking up for myself, like, that feels like I'm going against everything that I've known, for so long. So that's extremely difficult.
Yeah, it feels like guilt, and it connects back, I think, for a lot of people to feeling selfish in some way. Sorry, feeling selfish in some way, that it's almost like this internal statement that it's not okay for me to have needs or for me to be more important than anyone else.
Right. When it absolutely is. But anyway, at that point, it just, so true. And lastly, it's hard to set boundaries because there's, once again, a lot of uncertainty around how to express a boundary clearly. Like you said, sometimes people come in, they're like, oh, I told them what to do. And like we said, now we know that's a demand rather than a boundary. It can be confusing at first, but that's where therapy comes in. That's where we kind of help guide you towards what effective boundary setting looks like, how to be more assertive, things like that.
And like you said, I think we see a lot of this in counseling and therapy, and counseling and therapy can be really helpful for even this aspect of things, right? To learn what I want my boundaries to be, how I could communicate that to people in my life in specific situations. So like, you can come in and say, this is the specific situation. How would I even set a boundary in this particular situation? And it can be helpful to explore what you want this to look like in your life, in your unique life, and your unique experiences. So I did my best here, trying to give you just like a quick self-test, right? To kind of just challenge yourself and reflect and ask yourself, like, am I honoring my own limits, my own boundaries? Do I respect myself in that way, right? So, okay, answer yes or no to the following questions. 1, do I notice when I'm feeling emotionally or physically drained? And do I take steps to recharge that if I am emotionally or physically drained? Number 2, can I say no without giving a long-winded explanation or feeling guilty afterwards?
Number 3 is, do I schedule time for myself, not just for others' needs or requests? The next one would be, when something feels off or uncomfortable, do I trust myself enough to speak up or step back? And lastly, do I feel like my relationships respect my time, my energy, and my emotional space?
And I feel like these are really great points for reflection. And feel free to pause and go back and really sit with each of these questions, which is what I would encourage you to do. But I feel like these are really good to kind of dig into the self-reflection of, if I am feeling emotionally and physically drained all the time and I never recharge, if I feel like I cannot say no without over justifying myself and then also feeling guilty too. So it feels like I have to say yes, right? I feel this pressure that I always have to tell other people yes. Not scheduling time for yourself, you know, feeling uncomfortable in situations and not trusting yourself. Or maybe even you look back at your life and you say, like, you have these regrets of like, I should have done this differently. I shouldn't have let this happen. I should have spoke up for myself, whatever. And then 2, just really sitting with that last question, I think, do I feel like my relationships respect my time, energy, and my emotional space? That's a hard
Absolutely.
one.
It is. Wow. But those are super helpful questions because it really will provide you some clarity of like, man, maybe I do need to kind of make a change, for sure.
Like, am I putting all of the effort into this relationship or situation or friendship or whatever it may be? So where in my life do I feel consistently overextended? And what would it look like to set one small limit there? So this question is kind of moving into change, right? It's asking me to identify an area where I do feel like I'm being stretched a little bit too thin and what it would even look like if I did set a limit there. And this can be a good place to start in exploring what you want, what boundaries should look like for you, right? Because it's different for each person. Like if we go back to the types of boundaries, right? So for example, like the example we gave, physical boundaries, what are you comfortable with in terms of how close to another person can you physically be before you experience discomfort and you don't want to be there anymore? Or do you have no boundaries and you're just kind of like, I don't care how close you are, I will hug a complete stranger and it doesn't bother me. I mean, people are different. And this is why I say this is such a personalized process of trying to figure out for you, your values, what you specifically want out of life. What do these boundaries need to look like for you? And where you do feel overextended, what is a small limit that we can enact in this situation? I'm trying to think of an example that we could give for this. Like if let's say that I am in, I don't know, let's say that my supervisor keeps asking me to add tasks onto my daily tasks and I feel overwhelmed and overextended. And I feel like I can't say no because obviously they're my boss. So this is the situation I'm looking at and I say, okay, what is one small limit that I could set here that I would be comfortable with? Maybe it looks like, communicating to your boss, hey, I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed right now. I just wanted you to know that, full disclosure, like full transparency. I feel like I have a lot of tasks that I'm juggling right now. Maybe that could be a limit or boundary, communicating what's going on with you and then seeing how that interaction plays out.
Yeah, for sure. Just learning how to take things off of your plate little by little. I think a good question I like to ask sometimes is, am I taking this on because I truly want to do it or because I feel pressured to, or because this is what I'm used to? And I think questions like that can be so helpful for trying to make those small adjustments and limits for sure. Yeah. And I like that you also brought up, acting in your accordance with your values, because that is what boundaries are about, is about learning to live more authentically and learning to put your needs 1st. So for sure. Love that. So whenever it comes to healthy boundaries, there's some ways to kind of phrase these things, some language that we want to talk about now. One of those is being, I'm not able to take that on right now. I need some time to think about that before I commit. So often we feel like we have to provide an answer right away.
Now, yeah.
Like, oh, yes, I can do it. It's no problem. But we have that power to kind of wait, take a minute to think about it. Like, I'm not sure at the moment, but I'll get back to you. Like that can be such a powerful step for a people pleaser because then that pressure of automatically having to say yes and make that decision is off, So that's huge. Another way to communicate healthy boundaries is to say, that doesn't work for me, but here's what I can offer. Or I appreciate you asking, but I have to say no. And all of these, like we said, are super respectful. Like we're not being, rude or abrasive with this language. But it's just, it's a different way of communicating with others.
And there's a way that we can phrase these things where we're not being rude. We're not being dismissive of other people. Like, for example, I can say, thank you so much for thinking about me for this. I'm really flattered that you think that I would be great for this task or whatever this thing is. But unfortunately, I am just drowning right now and I am exhausted. I have way too many things on my plate. Can we talk about this again, next month or whatever?
Right.
Another great example can be, let's say someone asks you to do something last second and you just do not have the time today or the mental space for it. So you could say something like, hey, unfortunately, I just do not have the time today, but I would love to do that thing with you. Can we do it tomorrow maybe instead? So even offering a compromise of, being firm in, I cannot follow through with this right this second. However, we can talk about this to schedule it at a later time whenever I'm not drowning on a particular Tuesday,
I was literally thinking of that example. So that is perfect. Yes.
Yeah, see, it's double therapist approved there for you.
Yes. Love it.
So one thing to note here though, too, is that usually, especially in our life, relationships, friendships, whatever, when we have a tendency to not have boundaries in our life or with certain people, when we do suddenly start setting them, it's normal and natural that they're going to be pushed, right? And even if you are a person who has always been great about boundaries, you can probably speak to the fact that yes, they get tested quite frequently. Every person is different, every relationship is different. So it's normal to experience and expect a certain level of boundaries being tested in relationships. It's just like kids, right? For those of you that have kids, you set a boundary with a kid, you tell them, we're not going to do this thing. Of course, they're going to push the limit and they're going to test it. That's what we do as human beings. We're no different. So pushback is normal. Remember that. Putting ourselves in the situation of the person we're setting a boundary with, for them, they might feel threatened or confused because this is a complete change in how you usually respond.
Yeah.
It would be natural to get defensive, confused, or even argumentative in those moments of why all of a sudden or now is this a problem for you?
Right.
So common to happen. But the thing is that with boundaries, consistency is key, right? Boundaries need follow through. They need, if I say that I'm going to do something, if I say I'm going to walk away when we start yelling, it's important to walk away whenever we start yelling. Once again, we're not responsible for other people's reactions to our behaviors. It's also important if our boundaries are pushed or tested or we're experiencing stress from this, engage in self-care, right? Emotional energy might feel drained, especially initially when we're trying to change these patterns. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of emotional investment. So it's normal to feel a little bit more drained initially because we're having to consciously change our actions, behaviors. Like it's exhausting. It is.
Absolutely. Restart. So, like we've been saying, boundaries can be difficult to set. These are some things that we're not used to. It's a complete shift from how we've kind of been brought up to act and behave for most of our lives. So, of course, it's going to be difficult to make this adjustment right away. So, now I just want to take some time to provide some encouragement for our listeners who might be feeling, hesitant or nervous to start setting boundaries. So, it's really important to remember that boundaries are learned skills. You're not behind, you're just practicing. And hopefully, with this podcast, listening to it will kind of help provide you with some more education and insight of what setting boundaries looks like, really being reflective with yourself and asking like what do I want to accept in my relationships, what is something that I'm not going to compromise on, how can I put my needs first rather than feeling like I don't have a choice in what I say or what I do. So yeah, it's a practice at the end of the day. It takes time, but it's going to be so worth it in the long term.
And especially if you're young and you're kind of the traditional college student, this is a peak time in your life. You're like doing social relationships all on your own. Relationships are getting more complex, more complicated. Things are changing. We're like getting adult lives now where everything is kind of swirling, right? So you're just now figuring this out. You were never supposed to have the answer up until this point.
Right, absolutely. And also just remembering that it's okay to disappoint others to stay true to yourself. It's kind of something that we have to put ourselves first at the end of the day, as cheesy as it sounds. And it's remembering that I think that most people in your life will be able to adjust to these boundaries, because I would hope that the people in your life want what's best for you and to be fulfilled by the relationship that you have with them. And just learning that it's a part of the process. But ultimately, like we've said, the long-term benefits are going to outweigh the short-term maybe discomfort that's coming from this boundary setting. And lastly, boundaries aren't barriers. They're bridges to better communication. And they're absolutely super important for healthy relationships with others.
Yeah, and they are. And, I'd like to end today on some more questions for reflection because I'm on a kick lately about reflecting on questions. So, do I feel overwhelmed, exhausted, or resentful after interacting with other people? And I would even reflect on this one to the point of, are there specific people in my life that I consistently feel overwhelmed, exhausted, or resentful after interacting with this particular person? And then asking myself to kind of dig in and say, like, why? What is it about that person, the way they talk to me, the way that I feel like I have to talk to them? Like, what is it about those interactions that is so exhausting for me? And we can kind of start digging into maybe communication pattern here is not helpful for me. And is it a boundary issue? Is it people pleasing? Like, what, really digging into there to see what is the actual issue? Is it them? Is it me? Really digging in, playing detective with it.
Right. I think it's also important to realize that it can be more difficult to set boundaries with certain people than others, you know, and asking, like you said, what is it about this relationship that makes it feel so difficult or that leaves me feeling so resentful or exhausted?
A common one that I hear is that even if I said how I feel, they wouldn't care or they would minimize it or it would, it wouldn't be productive even if I did
Yeah.
assert myself. I hear that a lot.
So sometimes it's like, why even try? That can be discouraging for sure. But yeah.
So another good point for reflection, do I often say yes when I really want to say no? And is this tied to specific situations? Because I've heard this with people before where like, oh, at work, I feel like I always have to say yes. I feel like I cannot say no. I will get in trouble or everyone will judge me or whatever, whatever, whatever. Is it tied to a specific situation, person, place, identity that you have? So kind of really digging into if I do frequently find myself saying yes when I want to say no, where, how, what, and why does that occur in my life?
Even reflecting on just kind of another question onto another question, but like, what would happen if you said no? Like, what is that ultimate fear deep down that would come from saying no?
And kind of playing that tape through in our imagination and see why that would bother us so much. Yeah,
definitely.
That's a good one. So do I find myself agreeing with people just to avoid conflict or discomfort? And I do really like this one because I feel like even in my day in life, like today, I can say, yes, there are some times where I just agree with people to avoid conflict or discomfort in that situation, like in my personal life, right? Because I feel like boundaries are so hard because like we were talking about earlier, certain people in our lives that we know who they are, we know how they are, we know how they're going to respond because we've tried before. And you almost have to compromise and say like, okay, if I'm going to have this person in my life, then sometimes I'm just going to have to agree to avoid conflict to have them in my life. And then that's a personal thing. Like, is the relationship worth that for you? And are you happy with that?
Right. And also just the idea that confrontation can feel like one of the scariest things for people pleasers. So of course it makes it so much easier to avoid that conflict or that discomfort whenever in reality, conflict isn't something that should be feared or avoided because there's so many ways that we can resolve it, in healthy fashions.
I mean, it shouldn't be, but a lot of us aren't given the skills to
navigate
right. conflict.
But that's like a big part of learning to shift out of these patterns is seeing that, okay, conflict is something that we can work through. And after working through it, the relationship will either be stronger or not as affected as we thought it would be.
I think part of it is finding that confidence in yourself that I trust myself to navigate this conflict and stay true to myself and take care of myself, even despite this conflict, which is hard. I feel like that's a hard thing for anyone to do.
It is, yes. Another good question is, do I take responsibility for other people's feelings or their problems? So like I was mentioning earlier, sometimes it's so easy to feel like when someone else is going through something that can be translated onto us and we feel the impact of that stress, of that sadness, that anger, and that's extremely draining, and it's something to really just reflect on and ask yourself, what's causing me to feel like I have to take ownership for someone else's problems or their feelings,
And I guess I'm just over here thinking, like, if I'm a person listening to this and I'm like, what does that even mean? Taking ownership, taking responsibility for someone else's feelings. Like, there's nothing wrong with empathizing and we should empathize. Like, for example, if, a friend is going through a breakup, I can be there for them and say like, oh my gosh, that sucks. That's so hard. I'm so sorry that you're going through that, and feel what they're feeling, but also put it down and walk away and live my own life. Whereas taking responsibility for people's feelings is, my best friend's going through a breakup, they tell me, and it's all that I can think about. And it bothers me almost as much as it bothers them when like it's objectively not my life. It's not my relationship. It's not my problem. But, so there is a line there where like you can be there for people, feel what they're feeling, empathize with them, assuming for you that it becomes unhealthy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like you said, there's a fine line between being able to empathize and support someone versus feeling like I have to take on the entire weight of, what they're going through. So absolutely.
Yeah.
Another great question is asking, do I feel guilty when I prioritize my needs or say no? And that's a really common thing that people experience. Like I said earlier, whenever we feel like we have to show up for others, do things for others to be liked, to be accepted, whatever it is, of course, it's hard to stand up for ourselves, to say, no, this is important to me. This is what I won't compromise on. And to work towards saying no. It can be very hard.
Yeah, if I were to tell you, I want you to take 24 hours and do nothing but things that bring you joy, if that makes you uncomfortable, the idea of that makes something in your stomach go, ugh, then I would indicate probably, there might be some guilt there for prioritizing yourself or your needs or saying no in some way.
Yeah.
Do I allow others to vent or unload on me even when I'm not emotionally available? This is a great example of a boundary too.
Yeah.
Even being able, I feel like this is a very basic and simple one, right? That we can all relate to. When you're having a day, and by a day, I mean a day where you are just, it's been a day, you know what I mean? And someone comes to you and says, hey, can I vent to you about this situation? And, you genuinely are trying not to cry at any given moment, or you genuinely are just at your wits' end. Do you have the ability in that moment to say, hey, I'm having a rough day.
Yeah.
Can we like put a pin in this and talk about it later or tomorrow? And even the flip side of this, right? Before we vent to other people, being able to say like, hey, do you have the space for me to just vent and yap right now about something that's frustrating for me? So even just checking in and asking like, can I vent to you? Do you have space for it? But this can be a really great way to kind of pulse check this idea and see, do you prioritize yourself and your emotional bandwidth in those situations?
Yeah, for sure. Because if we do take on, others' emotional loads whenever we're, like you said, at our wits' end, then we're not able to be present. We're not able to be as supportive and as empathetic as we would truly like to be. Yeah. So whenever we can set that limit, say, hey, today I'm sorry, I have too much on my plate right now, but I'd love to do this another time. That can be so important. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the last point for reflection, how often do you avoid confrontation, especially when something really, really bothers you? If you were to give me a percentage, 0 to 100% of how often, how likely you are when upset and genuinely bothered by someone else's behavior, something they did, said, whatever, how often are you avoiding that confrontation, avoid addressing it? Well, I'll just, I'm not going to talk to him about it because it's not worth it, or I don't want to, or I can't, or whatever it might be. I feel like that percentage can say a lot of, how much are you prioritizing yourself, your feelings, and yourself in relationships.
Okay. Thanks for joining us today in your go-to space for honest conversations about mental health and well-being. We're your hosts, Madison
and Brittany,
and we're glad that you spent part of your day with us. Remember, taking care of your mind is just as important as taking care of your body. Be kind to yourself, reach out if you need support, and know that you're never alone. Until next time, take care and